Hello, my name is Dr. Gareth Mulvenna, and welcome to this talk entitled Dear John, the Loyalist News and John McKeague. First of all, I'd like to present a little note from the Lindenhall Library. Welcome to the latest instalment of this short series of online talks brought to you by the Lindenhall Library. The library continues to be closed at present, but it's still working on ways to engage with its audience. Please continue to consult the website www.lindenhall.com for news and events. You can also keep up to date with the library via their social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Okay, thanks for tuning in. It would have been, you know, obviously better to be doing this in front of people in the Lindenhall Library itself, but it's still great to have been asked to give this talk. I was asked to talk about some of the best finds that I had discovered in the Lindenhall Library's Northern Ireland political collection over the years of my research. But instead of going through different artifacts or magazines, I decided to concentrate on one publication, which is the Loyalist News. So for anybody interested in early 1970s loyalism, this will be absolutely superb and right up your street. Hopefully, for people who aren't just as interested in that topic, this will be educational and it'll maybe encourage you to go to the Lindenhall Library and check out the Loyalist News and other similar newspapers and find out a bit more about what was going on in Loyalist communities in the early 1970s. So basically, I just want to talk about the importance of the Lindenhall Library political collection. Yep. So the Lindenhall Library Northern Ireland Political Collection is, as it says on the slide, an invaluable resource. As you can see from the numerous photocopies I've taken from material in there. It was a massive help to me while I was doing my Masters at Queen's University Belfast, again while I was doing my PhD in Queen's University Belfast, and then when I was working on my first monograph, Tartan Gangs and Paramilitaries, the Loyalist Backlash, which was published in 2016. And it continues to be of crucial crucial resource for me as I engage in research on a book with PUP leader Billy Hutchinson on his life story, which will be published by Murray Press later this year. So in the early 1970s, there was a proliferation of loyalist news sheets, as there was on the Republican side and other political outlooks. One of the very early ones was the one on the left there, the Shankill Defence Association news sheet. That was one of the precursors to the Ulster Defence Association, and of course, even up until the end of the recent troubles and in the aftermath of the peace process, the WDA would still retain a unique identity, which you would be corrected if you describe somebody from the WDA as a UDA member. So these newspapers again are very specific in that they speak to unique identities and sort of groups. And the WDA one is interesting in that it predated the emergence of the Ulster Defence Association. Another one of these papers that was around at the early stages of the Troubles was the Orange Cross. It was formed as a welfare movement by Billy Spence, the brother of Gusty Spence, and Billy's son Edward Spence. They were running a campaign to clear Gusty Spence's name after he had been convicted and imprisoned for the murder of young Catholic barman Peter Ward in June 1966. The interesting thing about the middle edition is that that is one of the first, if not the first, editions of the Orange Cross, and it was John McKeague who would later go on to become involved as the creator and editor of the Loyalist News, who helped Billy and Edward create and print this copy of the paper. The edition on the right is a more conventional copy of the Orange Cross, after John McKeague had become separated from the printing process, and the Spence family had decided to go out on their own and design it and print it in their own way. So, as I say there, in the Orange Cross was a movement and a newspaper which sought to clear the name of Custody Spence. It also became a movement for the families of Loyalist prisoners, a welfare movement for Loyalist prisoners themselves. And it's interesting in the context of the Lindenhall Library and political collection, because I know the Orange Cross is housed in there as well. And we'll come to some of the artifacts in the Loyalist News later on in terms of this topic. But I remember asking Edward Spence a couple of years ago, did he ever think that researchers like myself would be looking at the Orange Cross in the year 2016 as it was at the time? And he said he had absolutely no idea that that would ever happen. And given some of the personal information about people, pictures, personal details, it's incredible to think that that was in circulation during what was an extremely violent and bloody period of the Northern Ireland Troubles. But again, it gives historians like myself, researchers like myself, an amazing insight into the Loyalist culture, both politically and paramilitary, in the early 1970s. I want to concentrate on the first 2 or 3 years of the Loyalist News up to 1972. Um, and even in that short period of time, you can see that it went through a number of different iterations. I think it was one of those. John McKeague was obviously one of those sort of people who was restless with designs and grew tired of certain designs very quickly. So from left to right, you can see four very different designs, all within the short 2 year period that I concentrated on my research of the Loyalist News. So people might say to me, well, why the Loyalist News? Well, for me, it gave me some background on the events that I was looking at, which was the formation of the Red Hand Commando in 1970 and the resultant emergence of the Tartan gangs in correlation with that uh, ongoing Protestant and Loyalist militancy, and then eventually the so-called Protestant backlash in 1972. So, who is John McKeague? Well, basically, John was the editor and creator of the Loyalist News. John had a printing shop, newsagents on the Albert Bridge Road in East Belfast. He also had offices in Milton Street on the Shankill Road and had access to rooms in the Bricklayers Arms off Milton Street on the Shankill Road, which was just opposite where Berlin Street is now. It's changed quite significantly due to redevelopment, but Wilton Street was where John and the nascent Red Hand group would meet, and where the newspaper would sometimes printed. But at this stage, it's necessary to go back and look a bit at John's life. John was born on the 20th of March 1930, which means at the outbreak of the Troubles he was in his late 30s, mid to late 30s. Um, An interesting thing about John is that his father died. He came from quite a large family. His father died in 1946 from wounds received in an accident while employed as a policeman, which exacerbated wounds that he'd received on the battlefields of the First World War in 1916, and he died in a UVF hospital. John at that stage was 16 years old, making him or forcing him to become the breadwinner for the family. And the McKeague family were heavily involved in sort of military service, loyalist politics, Orangism. So it came as no surprise that in the 1960s, John McKeague became involved with Ian Paisley and the Ulster Protestant Volunteers. Although later on, um, McKeague would talk about how himself and Paisley separated, went different ways in the late 1960s. And in 1980, Donald McKeague said, in 1969, I would have licked Paisley's boots on the very ground he walked on, but I later found out he wasn't the man I thought he was. And he wasn't, McKeague wasn't the first or last person to feel that way about Ian Paisley. But in the late 1960s, John McKeague became the chairman of the Shankill Defence Association, The Shankill Defence Association ostensibly started as a concerned residents group protesting against redevelopment and slum clearances in the Shankill area, but under McKeague's leadership, it quickly became what they would have described as a defensive organisation during the conflagration of the summer of 1969, when interface areas um, became very volatile in areas such as the Crumlin Road and other redoubts across Belfast. And McKeague um, made a name for himself as a militant leader who was heavily involved in encouraging Protestants to move out of Catholic areas or mixed areas and vice versa. And at that stage, the people I've talked to would have seen the SDA as a defensive organisation. Obviously, people from the Republican side would have a very different perspective of that. But things really become interesting in terms of the research that I carried out in 1970, because if John McKeague is often relegated to a footnote or a sensationalistic anecdote in trouble historiography, then the Red Hand Commando is almost completely absent in histories of the Northern Ireland Troubles. Now, fortunately, when I was carrying out my early research in Tartan gangs, I tied in with a former member of the Red Hand Commando from East Belfast, Robert Nimblock, who you might know better as a brilliant playwright and poet, who has written two major plays, Reason to Believe and Tartan, and has produced a series of poetry booklets. Uh, Robert introduced me to a man from the Shankill Road area named Ronnie McCulloch, who in the last weekend of June 1970 was one of a number of Orange men who were attacked by Republicans on the Crumlin Road during the annual White Rock Parade on the 27th of June 1970. And Ronnie McCulloch had just turned 18 at that stage. He'd turned 18 the month before. And the the McCulloch and his friends became the nucleus of what would later become the Red Hand Commando. They basically agreed to become that group in June 1970, which I'll talk about a bit later on. But subsequently, John McKeague was approached by these young men as the chairman of the Shankill Defence Association, and he was certainly galvanised by what they were planning to do. So again, that question, why the Loyalist news? Well, for me, talking to people like Ronnie McCulloch and other people who were involved in the early troubles in the Shankill was something that I never imagined I would get the opportunity to do, and it was really significant for my research. And I think my book, which I'm holding up there in that vaguely sinister photograph, um, was the first book to give any credence or comprehensively analyse or include voices from the early and first members of the Red Hand group, who organised in that summer of 1970. So to get a broader flavour, I talked to Ronnie McCulloch and other people who knew John McKeague very well. John was obviously killed in January 1982, so there was no chance for me to talk to John, obviously. So I wanted to get a flavour of what John was like from the perspective of people who knew him, obviously, but also I wanted to get an idea of what he was like from in his own words. I've watched some news or television interviews, listened to some radio interviews, read some newspaper interviews, but the Loyalist News really was the vehicle for John McKeague to get his voice out and the voice of his associates. And I think really John McKeague and the Loyalist News captured the mood music of this volatile early 1970s period in loyalism, and also maybe added to the mood music and galvanized people to go down a certain path. And obviously, as you'll hopefully see in this talk, there's many avenues for exploration for different pieces of research contained within just this 2 year period of the Loyalist News that I looked at. So again, this cartoon isn't from the Loyalist News, but it's from the Lindenhall Library. It's from the Orange Loyalist Songbook, which was one of the sort of annuals that McKeague produced under the guise of the Shankill Defence Association and the Loyalist News. Now, there's obviously the main thing I see when I look at this cartoon is it reminds me of what Plum Smith, who was an early member of the Red Hand Commando, wrote in his autobiography. He stated that in 1970-71, when the Red Hand group were beginning to organise and trying to develop their militant strategy, their arsenal was woeful. It was pathetic. It was like something from a World War One museum. So this cartoon, for me, reflects that very point that Plum was making. Other people, given the sensationalistic rumours about John McKeague's involvement in certain types of violence, might see it in a different way, and I obviously recognise that. But the first thing I see is the sort of well, loyalists having a look at themselves and saying we're not really equipped to deal with what's happening in the country at the moment in terms of what the provisional IRA are attempting to do. Another curiosity, and again, a lot of the work that I try and do, I mean, it may seem almost train spotting in certain in a certain light, the sort of minor details that I find interesting in research, but I think this is an important one because when people talk about the Ulster Defence Association, they always say that the first time the name Ulster Defence Association was mentioned was by a fella who stood up at a meeting of the various defence associations in the late summer, early spring of 1971. Um, and when they were trying to decide the name for this umbrella group, a fella who nobody knew apparently at the back of the room said, "Well, why not call them the Ulster Defence Association?" But here we have a year before, on the 5th of September 1970, as a very small article in the Loyalist News, um, titled Ulster Defence Association, and it's John McKeague being named as one of the chairmen of the 17 branches of the Ulster Defence Association. So again, I just think that's an interesting little snippet for people who are maybe taking forward research on the UDA, maybe explore that sort of even earlier period of the moniker Ulster Defence Association before the the what's usually agreed as the first mention, which is commonly held as 1971, whereas it was actually 1970. Researching the Tartan gangs and emergence of youth gang culture in the early Troubles brought me to investigate the role that football violence played in the early conflagration, and around September 1970, sort of the 70-71 football season, John McKeague becomes almost obsessed with this idea that Unity Flats, which was a nationalist enclave at the bottom of Shankill Road, Peters Hill, should be either completely destroyed, have a wall built around it, or turned into office blocks. Um, the reason for this was that Unity Flats had become a fulcrum for confrontation between loyalists from the Shankill and Republicans from the Carrickhill New Lodge area. Orange marches had been attacked in 1969 and 1970, and Linfield fans were attacked on their way to and from matches at Windsor Park. Although on the other side, Republicans would rightfully say that they were goaded and insulted by loyalists, Linfield fans walking past Unity Flats. And Billy Hutchinson told me before, Linfield fans would stop outside Unity Flats after matches or on the way home, and they would all sing "God Save the Queen." So it was all a bit of tit for tat, really. But McKeague becomes absolutely obsessed by this idea that the Unity Flats problem has to be dealt with. And again, that's given a lot of coverage in the Loyalist News at this period in September 1970. Again, this is a photograph of some of the Linfield fans on the last weekend, September 1970. week to or from match at Windsor Park, and the following week would be famous for Linfield playing a European tie against Manchester City and almost putting them out of the, I think it was the Cup Winners' Cup at the time. But this is a weekend in between where there was a confrontation between the Linfield supporters and the armed forces on the Shankill who were billeted in Snugville Street. Basically, the little joke in the Loyalist news, as you can see on the left hand side there, says Linfield supporters from the Shankill Road may soon have to charter a helicopter to get to Windsor Park on Saturdays. It is positively dangerous to walk to the city centre. If you're not picked off by a brick thrown by those loving people of Unity Walk, a worse danger may befall you, such as a bomb or a car bomb, I suppose, or an explosion of some type. So again, that's just an interesting sort of insight into the sort of thinking of what was going on at that time. Obviously, it's a joke, but you know the idea that Linfield fans couldn't, up to the early troubles, they were able to walk down past the Royal Hospital, down the Grosvenor Road, through the Falls. Now they weren't. They felt that they weren't even able to walk down Shankill Road past Unity Flats in Millfield. So this is a really interesting one because that weekend, Linfield fans returning from the match, and a lot of these, I say Linfield fans, were a lot of young fellas, such as Billy Hutchinson, Flint McCulloch, a lot of other people I interviewed who would either go on to become members of the Tartan, leading figures in the YCV, you know, Citizen Volunteers, or the Red Hand Commando. They were uh, doing their usual thing of stopping outside Unity Flats. There was a bit of to and fro with the police and the army. The special patrol group at this period had obviously decided to clamp down, and one of the things that seemed to inflame the situation was that a guy called who was known at that time as Billy the Dummy, who was deaf and dumb, as it were, was supposedly arrested for singing the sash, and this went around the crowd like wildfire, and hand-to-hand fighting started with the army and the police. The Kingdom were had a sanger in Snugville Street in the middle of the Shankill, and this became the epicenter of 2 or 3 days of serious rioting as young men returning from the Linfield game started to attack the base, and people from Woodville, Spring Martin, and Highfield defended by the Shankill, and the King's Own found themselves penned in. One young loyalist climbed to the top of the tiger and took the King's Own flag, which meant that they were disgraced in military terms, and this has gone down as a episode of Loyalist legend in this early period of the Troubles, and it was commemorated in a cartoon and a verge in the Loyalist News. The cartoon is specifically interesting because the soldier says to one of his colleagues, "Next time go for younger ones. Those 14-year-olds fight too well." And again, Billy Hutchinson, who has talked to me about this event, was exactly 14 at that time. Now, this is a really interesting one. Obviously, that should say the 23rd of October 1971 instead of 1071. But this is a letter that was contained in the Loyalist News on that date from a guy called James McKenna. Who is James McKenna? Who is Jimmy the Cat, James McKenna. James McKenna was a member of the armed forces from West Belfast before the Troubles. He went to live in Australia. He was in his mid-40s in, I think, 1971. But his family stayed behind in Ballymurphy, and his brother, Arthur McKenna, who was known as a gentleman gangster, ran card schools and pitch and toss games. And he and a friend were shot dead, supposedly or allegedly, by the Provisional IRA in Ballymurphy, who were at that stage trying to exert their authority on the community and demonstrate that they were now in charge of the community and not the guys like Arthur McKenna. It was described as a purge against antisocial elements in the community, or anti-people elements, and it was the Provisional IRA clamping down and exerting their authority. Jimmy McKenna obviously heard about his brother's death. brother's murder. Came back from Australia, missed a funeral by one day, and was subsequently arrested for having on his person, I think it was a revolver or a pistol. And he subsequently did some time in Crumlin Road Jail, and nothing was really heard of him, and it wouldn't have come up in any sort of mainstream media as being significant at the time. But this letter then appeared in the Loyalist News, which is an open letter to Cardinal Conway, where Jimmy McKenna lambasts Conway, lambasts the Provisional IRA, lambasts the soft approach of the Catholic Church towards the Provisional IRA. And ultimately, what emerges for those who are interested or knowledgeable about early 1970s loyalism, this is probably one of the most fascinating and underexplored aspects of loyalist paramilitary culture in the early to mid 70s. When Jimmy McKenna is released from Crumlin Road, he um, is filled with the need for revenge, and he approaches the UVF and the Shankill, has a discussion with Tommy West, who was a former marksman in the army, and offered his services as a person who has a lot of intelligence on the Republican players in West Belfast. Ultimately, uh, Jimmy McKenna, who was known as Jimmy the Cap, the people around him, became involved in intelligence gathering for the Young Citizen Volunteers before he eventually went back to Australia, and he later died in the 1980s. So again, when I first came across this letter, I just couldn't believe it that this guy had read about in a couple of books and a very few details about him in historical accounts. Here was a letter that was actually written by him. Fascinating document. Another absolutely fascinating document that came across in the Loyalist News was this. Um, it surrounds the events of two funerals in the sort of early spring of late winter, early spring of 1971, where some of the guys who met in the Bricklayers Arms, uh, who were members of the Red Hand, had um, come to protest against this funeral, where they heard that a tricolor was going to be on the coffin. It was going through the West Circular Road area, Ballygomartin, and these young fellas came out under the leadership of John McKeague to protest against the presence of the tricolour in their community. So what I'll do is, if you don't mind, I'll read a wee bit from Tartan paramilitaries to give flavour of what the events were that gave rise to this verse. A few days later, Bernard Watt's cortege made its way from Holy Cross Church on the Crumlin Road for burial in Milltown Cemetery in West Belfast. According to the historian Joe Graham, on the day of Barney Watt's funeral, the Irish national flag was draped on his coffin and placed in the hearse for burial as a mark of respect to the fact that he was murdered by British forces, not that he was a member of the IRA. So I say a crowd of around 100 loyalist youths, many with links to the Red Hand, had gathered to protest. The crowd had anticipated that the cortege would contain an Irish tricolour. One young man declared, "We have been here since early morning, and were determined the coffin would not pass through a predominantly Protestant area draped in a tricolour." Ronnie McCulloch was one of the assembled Red Hand members and recalls, "John McKeague was adamant that this must not be permitted to happen without resistance. The route was entirely Protestant and Loyalist. We were instructed to assemble at the Ballygomartin Road and West Circular Road junction. It was the aim to disrupt the funeral so that this route would not become the norm for any future occasions. The Irish tricolour was regarded as a foreign flag, and under such circumstances was being thrust into our faces against our wishes." When the cortege reached the junction of Ballygomartin and West Circular, temperatures were at boiling point. As the funeral cars approached some of the group, they blocked the path of the cortege using a hijacked council bin lorry. The hearse forced to come to an abrupt halt. The funeral procession was held up. McCulloch remembers, "During those minutes of confusion and confrontation, one young member of our Bricklayers Arms group rushed forward, opened the rear door of the hearse, and removed the Irish tricolour from the vehicle. Martin Meehan, a prominent provisional IRA member from Ardoyne, another Republican mourner swiftly exited their cars, and a gun was said to have been produced. Later in the day, Jim Saunders' funeral procession made its way from his home in Ardalea Street in the Bone area of the Old Park Road. Before setting off, it had been given a guard of honour by masked and armed IRA members. Saunders' cortege made its way to Milltown via an alternative route. An angry Loyalist mob, numbering around 300 and waving flags, forced the cortege to detour off the road. Then, as the funeral procession passed by the Unity Flats and Upper Library Street flashpoint, the young Loyalists who had been at the West Circular Road earlier in the day reappeared from the lower Shankill. McCulloch describes what happened. The young men and John McKeague ceremoniously burned the tricolour at the funeral procession. The removal of the tricolour by the Loyalist lad, as he was simply known then, became a cause célèbre across the divided communities of North and West Belfast. For a period, the young man's hat, which he had lost during the melee, was displayed behind the bar of the Standard public house on the corner of the Shankill Road and Agnes Street. The events also had ramifications far beyond the back rooms of Belfast's Loyalist bars. Dramatic footage of the incident was broadcast on UK television news bulletins, leading to songs being sung in honour of the lad by Rangers supporters at Ibrox. So basically, the fella who stole this flag was a man who died 4 years ago called Brian Moorhouse, who went on to become leader of UVF Red Hand Commando prisoners for a period in Long Kesh in the early 1980s. So again, this verse and cartoon is another contemporaneous depiction of an event as it happened. Basically, from the perspective of the people associated with the Red Hand Commando and John McKeague. Another interesting aspect of the narrative of Loyalist news at this time in John McKeague was the coverage around the death of his mother, Isabella McKeague, who was killed on the 8th of May 1971 when an explosion was placed, like a firebomb was placed in the flat above his printer shop in the Albert Bridge Road. And McKeague's elderly mother, Isabella, who lived with him, perished in the fire. John was actually at a Red Hand training camp on the North Coast and wasn't aware of his mother's death until he got a phone call and was driven back to Belfast. In the accounts, as you can see from the Loyalist News, and you can see John's signature there, where he thanks people for their notices and commiserations and sympathies. And also there was interviews with John at the time. There was a documentary that John spoke on at the time, where, as in this coverage, he blamed Republicans. Having talked to people who were close to John at the time, and I think John himself later admitted it wasn't Republicans, it was erstwhile colleagues who had experimented with these types of explosives, who John had fallen out with, who were attempting to kill him. So again, John puts across a specific message in the Loyalist news at this period of time, which deviated from perhaps what he was actually thinking, but it suited probably the narrative at the time, which was that Republicans were out to get him, which was the case as well. So it helped the Loyalist cause at that stage, but it's depressed the truth of the internecine feuding going on within McKeague's circle at that time. I think the next few slides will read through quickly. A lot of the stuff in the Loyalist news could basically be put down as a rumour mill. It was basically little articles, such as the one on the left, which names a prominent politician who's a member of Sinn Féin. This goes back to May 1971, and also, as you see, July 1972, the message in Monkstown, which was "Stop going with Kate from Lisburn. She's a Taig. Before I inform your unit of the UDA." So on the one hand, you see rumours about Republicans in insane and Protestant areas. On the other hand, you see attacks on so-called Lundies in the Loyalist community. May 1972, some 10 months before, maybe 9 or 10 months before, first internment of Loyalists, the Loyalist News reported that they had information that there was going to be soon internment of Loyalist personnel. So again, this would have heightened fears and raised the temperature in the Loyalist paramilitary culture at the time. This is, from the sublime to the ridiculous. Um, an article from June 1972, which states that Ulrika Meinhof, member of the Bader Meinhof gang, had been seen in Belfast, and that she was planning to work with the IRA against the Loyalist community. So again, while there are some things that are maybe close to the knuckle in the Loyalist news, there's some things that are completely far fetched as far as I know. So again, it's a little interesting snippet of the sort of thing you get in the Loyalist news that maybe um, puts two and two together and comes up with 16. So again, this is one of the probably things that people do know about John McKeague. In 1971, he was charged with one of the first people, along with two of his colleagues, to be charged under a law of with charged with incitement to hatred, basically, for a song that had been published in the Loyalist News, which was it was basically a skit on the Lee Marvin song "Born Under a Wandering Star," which was called "I Was Born Under the Union Jack," and obviously the the phrase in the song. There's a couple of phrases in the song that are extremely offensive, but the one that has become infamous is, "If guns are made for shooting and skulls are made to crack, you've never seen a better take than with a bullet in his back." Now, ultimately, John and his two colleagues were able to beat the charges with Desmond Bole as defence counsel. But this brought McKeague some, well, you say unwanted attention, but it probably raised his kudos within loyalist circles at the time, as being seen as a hardcore loyalist leader and somebody that was doing the right thing and saying the right things at the time. And that's why a lot of young loyalists were particularly galvanised by his leadership and presence and what he was saying at the time. So in 1980, John said that prosecution did me the world of good. I don't regret the book or the song. I was warned about it before publishing, but I said this is what they're singing, songs that were around printed just as they were sung, and it certainly didn't give John any reason to stop doing this type of thing. And one of the other infamous series of articles in the Loyalist News is on the next slide, which is Know Your Guns. And this article, which isn't the Know Your Guns one, is an article about how easy it is to buy a gun at that time. And basically, at this period in early 1971, this is what people were doing. They were forming gun clubs. This is the way they were ostensibly forming paramilitary units, and they were getting hold of weapons of all kinds. And I think, really, the play on the Beatles song title there is really interesting, where it says, or poses the question, can happiness really be a warm gun? Again, another sort of apocryphal little cartoon here is, you know, it's almost the Loyalist News saying, well, Republicans get it hard, but sort of Loyalists in the same way. And the cartoon there says, I know we've searched this street 6 times, but the captain says he's sure there's UVF weapons here, so look again. So that's July 1971, almost a year before the UVF really disentangle themselves from their intelligence gathering in in the Tara group and resurface as a formidable paramilitary force. So the next few slides, I'd like to talk a wee bit about the Tartan gangs. Again, the Tartan gangs were uh, groups of young guys at this stage who wore different patterned tartan scarves to denote which area they came from. There was the Shankill tartan, the Woodstock tartan, the Pass tartan, Rathcoole Kai, all different types of tartans, many different groups. This photograph by the photographer Billy Beggs from Donegal Pass is off the Shankill tartan. You can see the flag in the middle. This is the Shankill tartan, and you can see the tartan scarves around the wrists of the guy at the front. This is the Shankill tartan marching up past the gasworks on the Ormo Road to the Ormo Park, where the Vanguard rally in March 1972, where Joel Craig famously said, "It will be our job to liquidate the enemy." Yeah, so Craig at the Vanguard rally in March 1972 famously said, "It will be our job to liquidate the enemy," and it was young people like this who were most enthused by this message. And that's some of the young Tartan gang members in Ormo Park. And you can see the bus in the background. There was thousands and thousands of people there. And the guy second from the right is wearing, well, both guys in the middle there are wearing Vanguard stickers as well. Don't know if the Lindenhall Library has any of those. I'm sure knowing the political collection they have them away somewhere. So yeah, basically the Loyalist News, McKeague sees the importance of the Tartan gangs and how they could be useful in this emerging loyalist backlash against the IRA and Republican violence. An article from August 1971 is a warning to loyalist youth gangs. Protestants at war talks about the Woodstock Tartan and the Young Newton have been fighting it out amongst themselves, and that is what the Tartan gangs were doing at that stage. In April 1971, there was a newspaper article, front page of the newsletter, in fact, which said the gang warfare is a new threat to Ulster peace. And I talked about the Shankill Young Tartan and the Rats fighting each other. So a lot of this was about young Protestant guys and girls fighting over territory. But at this stage, as the Loyalist News says, for heaven's sake, catch yourselves on. Remember that Seaford Street and the Strand are the real enemies of the East. Let this be the final warning. And the front page of the Loyalist News after a confrontation between the Tartan gangs and the Short Strand in May 1972 brings about this declaration on the front page of the Loyalist News. One salient fact stands out from the events of last weekend. The Tartan were right to fight. In doing so, not only did they strike a brave blow for the Loyalist cause, but have shown the way forward. Only when Ulster adopts the fierce partisanship of our young sons and is prepared to fight as they are prepared, will our land be restored to us. So they were certainly McKeague was advocating what the Tartan gangs were doing and could possibly see a future for them in the Red Hand Commando. That cartoon tells its own story, really. Excuse me. So coming into the autumn of 1971, after the internment crisis of August 1971, you see the proliferation of these defence associations, vigilante groups. People begin to experiment with weapons, homemade explosives, that type of thing. You begin to see masked men on the streets of loyalist areas for the first time, and the formation of the Ulster Defence Association. So McKeague in the Loyalist News tells people to guard the street. You can see that article there. in this edition from the 11th of September 1971, and a sketch of what a typical Protestant house should be like. Barbed wire, charts, heavily galvanized metal doors. People were, and I've talked to quite a few people who were around at that time, and they were talking about not even defending your area, but defending your street against the IRA. And I was watching Pop Goes Northern Ireland the other night, the 1971 uh, edition, and you see the UDA on the streets for the first time, and they basically look like old fellas down to bookies, and they talk about how they don't have any weapons, and neither do they want weapons, because otherwise they would be the same as people who were attacking them. But a lot of the younger loyalists who I talked to thought, well, cudgels and, as one fella had, billiard balls and a sock, weren't going to do anything against the IRA. So they began to get weapons and form serious paramilitary organisations. An absolutely astounding piece of information in the Loyalist News, which again goes back to that idea that I was talking to Edward Spence about at the beginning, when I mentioned it at the beginning of the talk, or maybe I should say when I was talking to Edward Spence, I asked him, did he think these the Orange Cross would ever be in places like the Lindenhall Library or the Public Record Office for people like myself to research in the year 2016, 17, 18, 19, 20. He said that in all honesty, he didn't really ever think that the newspaper would go outside the circle of loyalism. And really, this is probably, in terms of the Orange Cross, it's because it had a lot of photographs and personal information about people who were members of the Red Hand Commando and the UVF. But this is absolutely astounding. There's an advertisement for the Red Hand of Ulster Bangor branch. This will be in 1971 as well. It says, will all members please contact the secretary as soon as possible? Very important. And it gives the address. And it subsequently came about that was the address of a leading member of the Red Hand who lived in Bangor. It was just his home address. Um, I've checked, and obviously he doesn't live there anymore. But that shows the naivety that people maybe had at that time, despite what was going on in the country. All it would have taken was for the IRA to read that copy of the Loyalist News and then know where to get one of the leading members of the Red Hand in Bangor. It's incredible looking back at it in terms of, people would be ultra sensitive about information like that nowadays, even in the 1980s and beyond, but in the early 1970s, it's just so given away with such ease that I don't know if Republicans had people reading newspapers to target certain individuals, but if it's just incredible. It really is. And I think to round off, this is really the crux of what the paper is really. It's a paper which speaks to the constituency of the Red Hand Commando, or as it was known, the Red Hand Commando Unit, the Red Hand Group, officially now known as the Red Hand Commando. Had a few different iterations in the early 70s before it became the Red Hand Commando, but it was always the Red Hand from June the 27th, 1970, when it was um, formed as a response to what had been going on in North and West Belfast at the White Rock Parade. And the 27th of June this year will be the 50th anniversary of the Red Hand Commando. Again, one of the organisations that's very little known about in terms of the Northern Ireland Troubles. But I'd just like to read one more excerpt from the Tartan Gangs of Paramilitary's book, and it's Ronnie McCulloch talking about the formation of this group. I and several other friends decided that we would meet in a house in the Old Park Road. It happened to be my mother's house in Rosefield Street. We discussed the situation of what had happened. It was decided that action would have to be taken. We would need to do something about it, otherwise it could happen again and again, and we would need to make a stand. We basically decided we would form an organisation, and we would ultimately train and arm and recruit to prevent similar circumstances happening again. McCulloch and the young men in his company from Shankill and Old Park areas crowded into the parlour of his mother's house and heatedly debated the events of that day. Feeling hamstrung by the implementation of the Hunt Report and increasingly alarmed by the violent actions of Republicans, the need for paramilitary action was established. The discussions which had taken place throughout the autumn of 1969 among McCulloch and his friends were revisited, and the birth certificate of an unnamed grouping, which would later become known as the Red Hand Commando, was verbally agreed. McCulloch says, in effect, we agreed on two founding principles for this proposed organisation. The first founding principle we agreed on was that we would fight to remain British, and we would not be forced into an all-Ireland Republic from Republican activities. And secondly, that we would fight to defend the Protestant people, or Loyalist people, our communities, from Republican aggression. So I think it's only fitting that on this 50th anniversary, almost, of the formation of the Red Hand Commando, that I've given a little overview of some of the most interesting aspects and stories from the Loyalist News, a paper which was edited and run by John McKeague, who was the figurehead of the Red Hand Commando. And hopefully this will add to giving the Red Hand Commando and John McKeague their place in the history of Northern Ireland's troubles, and it will hopefully encourage people to go into the political collection when things get back to normal and explore this story a little bit further. So thank you for joining this online talk brought to you by the Lindenhall Library. The library's next online event will be on Monday the 22nd of June at 4 p.m. when Alice Johnson will speak on middle class life in Victorian Belfast. Thank you and stay safe.